Hello again. I hope I'm visible. I hope you're not looking to a blank wall. Yes, my ribs do still let me know that that they're there. Now, not as bad as they were, but they're still letting me know that they're there. All right. Each of these errors, whether it be Lutheranism or Calvinism, mutated, they combined with other errors, they paved the way for the world in which we live. Here in the United States of America, though, given the fact that the colonies up and down the eastern seaboard, the 13 colonies, which were founded, the first permanent settlement in 1607 in Jamestown and in what became Virginia, and then later the other colonies, the 13 colonies that would be founded. The last one would be Georgia, that would be founded. And the 13 colonies, because they were English, were influenced by the Protestantism of England, certainly Calvinism, both of the Puritan, the Pilgrim variety, as well as the Puritan variety, and Dutch Reformed Calvinism, as well as all of the other areas in Pennsylvania with the Quakers, and with other Mennonites, all different types of religious error, where men could work together as brothers for the common good. But when men don't understand what the common good truly is, they can't ever pursue it, because the common temporal good has to be pursued in light of man's last end. But it's very important to understand the Protestant Revolution in England, because this has an impact both theologically upon what happened prior to and then after the so-called Second Vatican Council within the life of Catholics, as well as what's happened in society. Despite all that was happening on the continent, England remained Catholic. When Martin Luther was excommunicated in 1520 in the papal bull Exsurge Domine by Pope Leo X, England remained Catholic. And one of the firm defenders of the Catholic faith, and he probably died thinking he was a Catholic, an English Catholic, was Henry VIII, King Henry VIII in England, who acceded to power in 1509 and would then come of age, and he would die in 1547. And Henry VIII wrote a book to refute the errors of Luther in thoroughly Catholic England. Now, England had been Catholic. Now, there were proto-martyrs as early as the 4th century in England. But England had been converted essentially by St. Augustine of Canterbury at the beginning of the 7th century, sent there by Pope Gregory the Great. And over the course of time, England was Catholicized. The barbaric practices were eradicated. That doesn't mean there weren't problems and there weren't difficulties. But the great thing about the faith is that it's expressed in its beauty in different ways, in different places. The Spanish have their devotional customs. So do the French. The various Italian states had their devotional customs, the regions, the Germanic states, the Low Countries, Scandinavia, Poland, Hungary, all had their different customs, but it was the one faith, the one belief, despite differences of expression here and there, and despite some regional variations in the offering of the immemorial Mass of tradition, which were then later codified in unified with the Missal promulgated by Pope St. Pius V in 1570, and that Mass was such a fitting expression of the sensus Catholicus of the Roman Rite for the preceding 1,000 years or so, that all but 2 dioceses that had local usage dating back more than 200 years, who could opt out of that missal, promulgated by Pope St. Pius V in his bull Quo Primum. All but 2 dioceses in the West chose to accept the missal because it was a fitting expression of the immemorial Mass of tradition, despite the fact that there had been some regional variations from time to time in various places. But England was Catholic. Henry VIII was a Catholic. Yes, despite his sins, Henry VIII was a Catholic. And he wrote this book refuting the errors of Luther, and for that he was given a Papal Defender of the Faith Award. It is true that St. Thomas More answered some questions that Henry posed to him about the book, but the authorship was Henry's. Henry was no stupid man. He was a very intelligent man, classically trained. But his lower nature got the better of him. And he married the wonderful Catherine of Aragon, who was very beloved, the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. He married Catherine of Aragon, who loved him dearly, despite all of the infidelity. Catherine had been married to his brother, who died. He was free to marry his brother's wife when the brother is dead. That's not Herod the Tetrarch, who married his brother's wife while his brother was still alive. But Queen Catherine was not producing a male heir, and he desired to have a male heir. And so she had to be dispatched. As far as he was concerned, he couldn't kill her, because to do so would have meant war with Spain, and that would not have been a pleasant thing. So, and even perhaps a rebellion amongst his own people, because Catherine was very beloved. They loved their Spanish queen. Henry permitted himself to be exploited and manipulated because of his lower nature by this scheming Anne Boleyn, a teenager. And he petitioned Rome for a decree of nullity from his wife, claiming that, Catherine of Aragon, claiming that there was no true marriage because she had been his brother's wife beforehand. This was a rationalization. Now, it took 7 years for Rome to act, because Rome was mindful of the consequences. The Pope and the cardinals were mindful of the consequences that could occur. They did not want to lose England to the faith, and they knew that that could happen, that England could be lost to the faith if Henry was turned down. And Henry himself had some expectation of a favorable ruling, because Francis I, King Francis I of France, had received a decree of nullity in somewhat similar circumstances. And so he had some grounds, he thought, to hope. But when Rome did not act and ultimately declared the marriage valid, Henry, having been manipulated by Anne Boleyn, working in conjunction with Thomas Cranmer and the Lutherans, the crypto-Lutherans, who surrounded Henry VIII, convinced him to break from Rome. And he declared Parliament, declare himself to be supreme head of the Church in England. With that break, the social reign of Christ the King was overthrown in England. The English monarchs, at times, could have authoritarian tendencies, which is why the Magna Carta was formed, to put a check on the power exercised by King John I, the son of King Henry II, who uttered the words that inadvertently resulted in the death of St. Thomas of Becket in 1170 in Canterbury. Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest? And 3 of his barons did rid him of his meddlesome priest. But there's always the tendency for English kings to assert themselves over Holy Mother Church in matters that pertain to the good of souls or to the liberties of Holy Mother Church. St. Thomas Becket, St. Thomas of Canterbury, stood up in behalf of the rights, the liberties of Holy Mother Church in 1170. And with Henry's break from Rome, all of that was overthrown. And even though the princes of the various Germanic states ruled in very dictatorial ways, authoritarian ways, after they gave Luther protection, it was Henry VIII who, in his person, personified the contemporary example of the absolutist state ruler. It was Henry VIII who combined all of the power they had sought under himself. Henry, therefore, was the very instrumentality by which the modern authoritarian state, unchecked by the social reign of Christ the King, came to realization. And what we're seeing in our own day today is only the logical consequence. Because when Christ is not king, the devil must be king. And the devil can rule either in the form of a one-person absolute rule or in a collectivity. The people can sing the songs of the devil just as well as one man absolute ruler. And therefore, as a consequence of this fact, it is important to understand the nefarious deeds of Henry when breaking from England, taking England out of the Catholic Church, and engaging upon a bloody warfare against Holy Mother Church, against those Catholics who remained faithful. Ultimately, the seizure of the monastery lands, upon which the poor lived for a nominal rent, annual rent, usually a share of the crops that they grew. Thrown into poverty, many apostatized, in order to apostatize, in order to not to starve, or because they couldn't afford to pay the taxes. If you didn't pay the tax to support the Church of England, your property would be taken away. So many, and in Ireland they took the soup. In order to be fed, they took the soup. The persecution of Catholics, of those who remained faithful. The Church went underground. Priests said Mass, the true Mass of the ages, in private homes. Meanwhile, the so-called Church of England, the false, heretical, schismatic Anglican Church, that is not contrary to what Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger contends, or Walter Casper contended, the head for many years of the so-called Pontifical Council on promoting the unity of Christians, Christian unity. It is not part of the Western tradition. The Anglican Church exists merely because of the bloodlust of Henry Tudor, and for no other reason. It was created as a rupture from the Catholic Church. The Anglican rites were changed, the Catholic rites of the Mass, of Episcopal consecration were changed. All of the Anglican books which have been accepted for prayer and for liturgical purposes by Benedict XVI were declared to be heretical by Pope St. Pius V in his encyclical letter that excommunicated Queen Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry, by Anne Boleyn, excommunicated in Regnans and Incelsus, declared on March 5, 1870, the Anglican books to be heretical. Benedict XVI says you can use those books. It can't be that one pope makes a statement saying something is a heresy, and the other pope, another quote-unquote pope, says that's all right. That's why Ratzinger's not the pope, folks. You understand? God, the Holy, it means so much for papal infallibility, so much for truth, so much for God, the Holy Ghost guiding the Church. It can't be that Pope St. Pius V was wrong. That which was a heresy in 1570 must remain a heresy and an abomination in the sight of God in 2012. The Anglican rite of Episcopal consecration was declared completely null and void in 1896 in Apostolicae Curiae by Pope Leo XIII. And that Anglican rite of Episcopal consecration is almost identical to the conciliar rite planned by Onorevole Bognini, the conciliar rite of Episcopal consecration, which is why in the conciliar church, in the Latin rite, Roman rite, there are no true bishops. Except for those who were consecrated years ago, approaching 100, 90 years old, whatever. A handful of those are still alive. But they're not diocesan bishops anymore in the conciliar church. Protestant revolt in England has a direct impact. Luther has his impact upon conciliarism. So does Calvinism. So does the Protestant revolt in England. They all play a part. But, insofar as the civil state is concerned, the Protestant revolt in England made possible the rise, the absolute rise of the civil state, prime over Holy Mother Church, which was suppressed and forced underground. Priests were forced to hide. Between 1534 and the time of the break, in 1547, the time of Henry's death, fully 71,000 Catholics were killed in England. 71,000 Catholics who remained faithful, who would not apostatize, who would not lie. Those who remained faithful were killed. 71,000. That is fully 3% of the population of England at that time. Henry VIII was one of the great monsters of modernity. Among those killed was St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher, the only bishop to remain faithful. Out of the 100 or so bishops of England at the time of Henry's revolt, another 30 or so would remain with the Catholic Church when Elizabeth I took England out of the Church for good in 1558, following her accession to the throne and upon the death of her half-sister, Queen Mary, who restored England briefly to the faith for a 5-year period. But there were 30 or so who remained faithful at that time. But out of the 100 bishops in 1534, approximately, only one remained faithful. Those who remained faithful in times of apostasy are very few, usually. Doesn't mean those who remain faithful are any better. It doesn't mean they're going to save their souls. Just because you're right doesn't mean you're going to save your soul. You have to have charity. You have to treat others with charity. You have to be truthful. You have to be in a state of sanctifying grace. Being right isn't necessarily enough. It's not enough to get to heaven. You must be holy. You must love God. You must recognize you are a sinner and seek to make reparation for your sins by surrendering everything to our Lord through the sorrowful and immaculate heart of Mary. Now, Henry did not kill Catherine of Aragon. He sent her away, and as she was dying, she wrote him a letter to explain her true forgiveness of him, that she forgave him his sins, and how his Catholic heart, so darkened by sin, could not be moved by this. Meant that maybe he had some problems at the end. We presume nothing, but he may have had some problems at the end. We don't know for sure, but he might have. She wrote before she died, a natural death on January 7, 1536. Most dear Lord, King and Husband, the hour of my death now drawing on, the tender love I owe you forceth me, may case being such, to commend myself to you and to put you in remembrance with a few words of the health and safeguard of your soul. She cared about his soul. She loved him. She loved his immortal soul, which you ought to prefer before all worldly matters, and before the care and pampering of your body, for the which you have cast me into many calamities, and yourself into many troubles. For my part, I pardon you everything. True Catholic forgiveness, folks. And I wish to devoutly pray God that he will pardon you also. For the rest, I commend unto you our daughter Mary, beseeching you to be a good father unto her, as I have heretofore desired. I entreat you also, on behalf of my maids, to give them marriage portions, which is not much, they being but 3. For all my other servants I solicit the wages due them, and a year more, lest they be unprovided for. Lastly, I make this vow, that mine eyes desire you above all things. Catherine the Queen. Letter of Catherine of Aragon to her husband. You see, if England had remained Catholic, the English colonies founded would have been Catholic. Now, they would have been different than the Spanish colonies in what later became the United States of America, and in Mexico, and in other parts of Latin America. Spanish Catholicism, different than English Catholicism, and the French colonies. However, it would have been Catholic. There would have been the relationship between church and state. The civil state would have recognized the true church and accorded her the favor and protection of the laws. But everything changed in a revolutionary way. And it was at the Cathedral of St. Patrick in the city of New York that a series of sermons, 4 sermons were given, called Breaking with the Past, by Abbot Francis Aidan Gasquet, the abbot president of the English Benedictines, who described and gave a summary of the revolutionary process of these events that took place in England, which I want to close with, and then I'll pick up some of the aftermath in summary form of what happened in England, and then from there go into some of the secular philosophies that arose in England, and then we'll switch gears to discuss the arrival of Columbus in the New World, the apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the settlement of Catholic America, and distinguish that from the settlement of Protestant Judeo-Masonic America. Now, Abbot Gasquet wrote as follows, spoke as follows: "Suddenly, and almost as a bolt from the blue, difficulties between the King of England and the Pope began to show themselves. Grave events often spring from slight causes, and whatever may be said by professional controversialists, there can be no doubt that it was a mere love affair of Henry VIII which initiated the royal policy and finally dragged England into schism and heresy, that is, lust. To some people, indeed, in these days, the action of the Pope in refusing to allow Henry to have his own willful way and putting aside his lawfully wedded wife Catherine, and to marry another woman, with woman with whom he had had illicit relations, may appear to have been the height of unwisdom. Certainly, as a result, it has been the most disastrous consequences. It has had the most disastrous consequences to the English Church. But this, at least, all must confess that the Pope's courageous action, Pope Clement VII, his courageous action is a manifest proof of the impossibility of ecclesiastical authority interfering with outright reason in the indissoluble sanctity of a true Christian marriage. To obtain the support of Parliament, the king suggested that the nation had incurred the extreme penalties of praemunire by admitting the legatine powers of Cardinal Wolsey, even though this had been done with his royal knowledge and authority. His lay subjects were at once pardoned for a mere technical offense against the statute laws, but the clergy were excluded in order to hold the penalties in terrorem over them. With his royal hand on the throats of his ecclesiastical subjects, he demanded a recognition of his headship over the Church in England, and finally convocation, after a debate which extended over 32 sessions, gave an unwilling assent to a clause admitting the king as the protector and the supreme head of the English Church. This was the thin edge of the wedge by which the cleavage from Rome and the Pope was subsequently effected. At the time, there can be no doubt that the inward meaning of the acknowledgement was not understood. Dean Hooke said that the statement was not regarded as inconsistent with the legitimate claims of the papacy. It is certain that the title was not intended to imply what it implied when, 4 years later, it was conferred by an act of Parliament and when England virtually was severed from its Roman constitution. Father Abbot Gasquet also said a total change in liturgy along the Lutheran principles of the Reformation, and a different Mass, different sacraments, hundreds of religious bodies, all claiming to be Christian and all differing in vital essential matters of the belief, can be seen round us today. And this, Abbot Gasquet said, is the result of the actions taken by Henry. The United States is a bastion of error today, and of confusion, of self-seeking, of materialism, because of Luther, Calvin, and Henry VIII. What is the antidote? It's not conservatism. What is the antidote? Catholicism. I'm going to pick this up in a moment, and for the final lecture of today, Viva